It's also the 50th episode.
It is. It is actually. Yeah, I've seen this come out. Completely forgot about it again. It is. Happy anniversary. The podcast
Happy 50th anniversary. Yeah.
I think I made this joke before, right? This podcast will soon eclipse our age in terms of episodes.
Well, I am actually 50 right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it is as of next month. It will be older than me. But no, it's been a bit of a journey. I don't know whether we actually set out to. In fact, I know we didn't set out to make a podcast. It just kind of morphed into one over time. It started as a little kind of chat about what we were doing. We even had guests on the first few, which I do miss having guests. Actually, I think we should consider bringing people on occasionally, because I think it's good to get other people involved. But yeah, it's changed a lot since the very first days back on Twitter Spaces, which is where we started it, and then of course we kind of transitioned into being I hesitate to say a proper podcast, because I'm not sure I'd give it that, but certainly I'll take it a little bit more seriously.
Well, it is
and
listed on Apple Podcasts, right? So that absolutely makes it a proper podcast.
Yeah. The requirements for being listed as a podcast there, though, are very, very minimal.
Yeah, you're saying the validation isn't as tight as it is to get a package on the Swift Package Index.
Tim Cook doesn't go and listen to your podcast if you want to be on that list.
He'd have a lot on his hands to listen to all of them.
I remember, in fact, it was at the last Swift Server conference, which I think was actually 2022, the last one I was at. We'd just switched across to using doing the podcast as a kind of actual podcast rather than Twitter Space, but we were still recording on the microphones we were just using for those early ones. And somebody came up to me at the Swift Server conference and they said, "I really like the podcast, but please fix your audio."
Ooh, harsh. I like but it never ends well, does it?
I was well aware of and I'm not sure who it was. I didn't get their name. It was a very brief interaction. So if that was you and you're still listening, I did try and fix our audio. In fact, I've put many hours into fixing our audio. If that was you, I'd love to see if you think it's fixed. So please get in touch.
Nice.
So yeah, 50 episodes. It's a milestone of sorts.
Well, speaking of the Server-Side Swift conference, actually there was just after we recorded the last one, I went to the last episode of our podcast. I went to the Server-Side Swift conference in London, and it was great. It was great to see folks. Great talks. It was a 2-day conference this time. I think it was 1 day only in 22, which was the previous one. There wasn't one in 23. Yeah, great lineup, great news. So we actually got an Apple announcement of sorts again. There was a talk by Tony Parker and Ben Cohen. It was called Swift and Interoperability. God.
So that's easy for you to say.
And they announced Swift Java integration, which I found fascinating and great to see. So what this is about calling into Java from Swift and vice versa, calling into Swift from Java. And this is early days for the project. We'll drop a link in the show notes, also open source again, so you can follow along as stuff is being developed. And it feels like Swift is really gaining more and more superpowers when it comes to interoperating with other languages. And there was quite a bit of excitement around the conference as well when people were talking about it afterwards, because I can imagine there must be lots of big Java deployments that are perhaps sort of eyeing, a future replacement. Like Swift is supposed to be one of these successor languages for C++. I wonder if there's the same sentiment for Java, because there are lots of nice things about Swift compared to Java. And I've just thinking in terms of memory. Just today I looked at the memory consumption of our web application, which is a Swift on Server project, with 270 megabytes, and I don't think even that's particularly small. I think we have a couple of caching things happening that makes this a bit bigger than it would necessarily need to be. But I think in the Java world, that's a dream, to have to have that as your memory size. And I think that might be really interesting for lots of projects as a way to transition, and in particular because it really allows you to go bit by bit. So you can do this function by function, because you can call out into new code, and it really transitions slowly. And I think that's one of the greatest things with all these transitions that Apple always do, is making sure that you can do this bite-sized.
And memory efficiency, especially on the server, is really, really important, because it's one of the things that hasn't really come down in price very much in the last few years. Large servers with lots of memory are still very expensive, and memory seems to be the thing that you actually pay. That's what bumps the price up.
Yeah, absolutely. Our Linux builders are actually quite big in terms of memory, because builds often use a lot of memory, and CPU wise we would need I think it has an 8-core machine, which we wouldn't necessarily need, but the memory really drives up the price in that instance.
Same with our Mac build machines; they've got an enormous amount of memory, it's an expensive thing to do.
Yeah.
I think it's great to see Apple and the Swift team making these announcements at these community events, and especially I don't know, I presume it was Tim and his team that were responsible for doing this, but they were incredibly quick getting the video out so that the announcement could actually be public, because that was the only downside to it a little bit. I heard about the announcement, but not being at the conference, I wanted to write about it, but I had almost nothing to go on to actually write about it. I could see the repository, of course, but then the repository README is useful, but it's not really the announcement. It doesn't give you any of the context or anything like that. Now, luckily, the Swift Server Conference did publish their videos within a week, so by the next week, I was able to link to the video as well. But I did have to kind of write about it a little bit blind. But I love that they're picking these venues to, like last year or in 2022, the announcement Foundation, and this year with the Java Interop. Great, I applaud it. But if I could applaud it with also a blog post published at the same time, that would be even better.
Yeah, and speaking of the Swift Foundation announcement, Tony spoke to that a bit and gave a bit of a summary of what happened there, and that the transition effectively is complete. Like Swift Foundation is now shipping the open source one. That just happened during the Swift 6 beta phase, that they switched over to the open source version of Swift Foundation, which is really nice because it aligns the APIs with the Linux world. This is a place where we've seen a couple of times when stuff wasn't quite there yet. So that's great to see. A few other talks I wanted to give a quick shout out, and this was a server-side Swift conference, but and the reason I'm mentioning a few here is because they're more general. They're not server specific, really. Daniel Steinberg had a nice talk about when to make a macro. Really great talk, going a bit into the details there. Franz Busch talked about leveraging structured concurrency in your applications, again giving a nice summary how to transition over, adopt concurrency, Swift 6 concurrency. Babette Welge, a bachelor student, gave a talk about stop worrying about routes with Open API Generator. I found that nice because while Open API Generator is obviously server specific, you might have need for that. For instance, if you stand up a mock API, you're developing an app, and these days, I don't think hardly any app gets developed right without talking to an API, and you might actually want to stand up something that you can connect your app to while maybe production doesn't exist yet, or you want to inject some data, have some example data for testing or for generating screenshots, stuff like that. Depending on how you want to do that, it might be really nice to just take these Open API specification, just run it through that generator, and bring up a server that you connect to. So she gave a talk about that, how to use the Open API Generator. And then finally, Nick Lockwood with a really great talk. So you think you know Swift, and that was one of these where, there's lots of things in Swift that seem weird and you sort of struggle with, especially around strings. Is like the classic example. Why can't you index into a Swift string? And he explains why there are why it is the way it is, and also brings up a couple of things that maybe people don't even know, because Swift is a big language. There's stuff that you don't typically come across. So that was a set of talks I wanted to mention from the conference. There were quite a few others, more server specific, but they're all great. They're all worth checking out.
That's great.
And we'll add links to the show notes.
Sure. Yeah. I also had a note from. Well, so in the previous episode, one of my packages that I talked about was called Chip 8 Kit, I think, or some Chip 8 something. And it was about an emulation of an old computer system called a Chip 8. And I had a message from Mirza, who also got mentioned last episode as the person who contributed to the Swift Package Index, the forked from functionality that's now live on the site. And he dropped me a message on Discord and told me that a couple of years ago he had built a Chip 8 emulator, not as a Swift package, but as an iOS application. So if you were curious about the Chip 8 system that we talked about last time and wanted to play, the screenshot on the Git repository is playing Pong on the Chip 8 system. If you want, or Tic-Tac-Toe, I think as well, or maybe Snake as well. If you wanted to have an iOS version of that, I think it's worth to mention that there is this repository, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that as well. So thanks for the update on that, Mirza.
Nice. Another thing worth mentioning is a new repository. I think it's fairly new. It's GitHub Actions Workflows repository on Swift Lang. And what this does, it collects typical things you might want to run in your CI system. And I find that really nice because I tend to, sort of copy bits around from my previous repositories when I need something, or from like well-known repositories where I know they have solid setup, and I just steal bits and pieces here and there. But what this does is sort of, I think the idea is there for this to be the way to get started with a CI setup for a Swift package on GitHub with GitHub Actions. It has the typical thing you'd expect, like running tests. And it also has something which they call soundness checks, and that's stuff like formatting checks, linting, license checks, that your files have license headers and that stuff.
Sure.
And you can configure this. You can use these. I think there's a YAML file you can use to specify which parts you want to run, that sort of stuff. It's great to see that appearing. The only problem right now, as far as I could tell, this is currently only supporting Linux. So if you need to run this on macOS, you'll have to wait a bit longer for that support to appear, or make a contribution to add it.
Of course, yeah. It's also probably worth mentioning at this point, have you heard of a tool called Danger?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Yeah. So Danger does some similar things to that, like checking license terms and other things that you can configure that it will check as a kind of sanity check before your code goes in. And I think that I believe that does support Mac as well. It has been around for quite a while, so it's probably just worth mentioning that as well at this point.
Yeah. So that's GitHub Action workflows, and we'll add the link to the show notes.
So are we planning to implement some of those checks?
Well, I think it might be worth looking at which parts we could use. I actually added an issue to our issue tracker to at least explore what the options are. I had a quick scan. There's quite a lot in there already. And I think some of it would certainly be useful, like the soundness checks license. I mean, I think we're pretty... we don't add new files that often these days, and I don't think we miss adding the header, but just having that check in there would be nice. Formatting, certainly. I think you wrote about formatting as well on iOS Dev Weekly last week, didn't you?
I did, yeah. A rather opinionated piece, which I got lots of feedback in both directions on.
Oh, do actually, say there was more about formatting.
Yeah. There was more people in agreement with me than against me, but it was about 70-30, I would say.
I'd love seeing something like that be around, like integrated and running by default. I was nodding along as I read your comment about formatting on save.
I'm glad at least we're in agreement, because that's a good start. Somebody did actually drop me a note saying that they had published an Xcode plugin using the new single file Xcode extension architecture that you can bind Command S to, and effectively what it does is it runs Swift format instead of saving, but of course the Swift format then does the save. So effectively you can do what I was asking for. And if anyone's clueless about what we're talking about here, just go and read the latest issue of iOS Dev Weekly, which is issue 682. And I talked about Swift format and code formatting. But I think my point was, and that's that, an extension like that is fine, but my point was a bit bigger than that, in that I'd love to see, first of all, I'd love to see a standard, and nobody's going to agree on the standard, but I'd love for Apple to just say, this is how we format Swift code, just like Go did, just like JavaScript did. And this problem just goes away after somebody does that, but it needs to be somebody who's with authority. It needs to effectively be Apple, who do it. And then of course I would also love to see auto format on save, which is the key thing, because at that point you can just forget about formatting. And I say this with experience, because I've had this switched on in JavaScript and CSS for a very long time now, and I don't even bother trying to get the indentation right. I just type whatever I want and hit save, and it's done.
Yeah, I would.
It's so freeing. It's great. It's just a thing you don't have to worry about anymore. It's great. Anyway, so before you set me off on my rant again, let me stop.
Right. And finally, I wanted to mention something really neat that I saw on the Swift forums. I think it was just yesterday at time of recording. And there's a pitch up for the vector type, which is a fixed size arrays type. And there was Kare Lorente. I think he was certainly works at Apple, and I think he's also one of the authors of the proposal and the implementation. He talked about, so as you might imagine, there's a discussion about naming on the Swift forums, and he talks
a discussion about naming. That should be quick and simple.
Inconceivable. And he comes out in favor of the name vector, and tells a little story how they arrived at the name. It wasn't actually named that initially, and he says that very same day, two separate groups of people independently realized that copyability has now turned this type into a true vector, and that vector is the obviously right name for this construct. This made for a comical scene when members of the two groups met later in the day, fully expecting that they need to convince the other. I thought that was really neat when people actually independently arrive at the same conclusion and then feel like, oh God, I now got to convince someone of a different name, which I can imagine. We see these discussions happen all the time, right? When people have settled on a name, it can be really hard to convince them of a different name. So yeah, I found that really neat.
Yes, yeah. Shall we do some packages?
Let's do some packages. I've only got 2, so I'm going to let you kick us off.
Sure thing. I can kick us off with a package from Christian Selig called Tiny Storage, and it's a simple, lightweight replacement for user defaults that makes access a little more straightforward, plus some niceties. So the README of this starts with a link to a blog post, actually, where Christian was having some issues with user defaults, and I think it was largely around needing to access user defaults kind of immediately at the app startup, and there were some kind of inconsistencies there with things not quite being ready when he needed them. So I think he looked at building an alternative, and it must admit it looks like he's done a very thorough job of doing this. So some of the features that it has, the primary one, the first bullet in the list is relating to that point that I just mentioned there, which is reliable access even on first reboot or in application pre-warming states. Tiny Storage will read and write data properly. It's got codable support, of course. It's got a property wrapper for an app storage like wrapper that you can use in SwiftUI and things like that. You've got you can subscribe to Notification Center notifications when things change. It uses OS log for logging, so it's really. And that's I think I'd listed like 4 or 5 of the 12 bullet points that are in the features list there. So it's quite a comprehensive package. It is brand new, so of course be a little cautious with a package that is brand new, because all brand new code has bugs in it. Of course it does. It's only been in development for 6 days, and I believe it's been out a few days ago. So it is presumably. It was a clean commit just before the open source release, because I'm sure it had development before 6 days ago. But yes, it is. And it looks like it also has a mechanism similar to app groups for sharing data between your applications on the same phone, so from the same developer. I haven't looked into that in great detail, but I just noticed it now. So it looks great. I mean, it's effectively user defaults, but different.
Yeah, and I think it's worth calling out. You mentioned it in quoting from the README. I think it fixes one of these, the problem that spawned this whole thing. I saw the blog post, and I think it's worth calling out what actually can happen with stock user defaults when an app is launched in the pre-warming phase, or by some other means while the device is locked. It can happen that the user defaults isn't accessible, and then it gets reset to the app's stock defaults, and then you lose the data that's in it. And that's the investigation that I think this triggered him to write this replacement, which doesn't have that problem.
Right.
So
I believe the keychain can also get in that state as well, because if the phone is locked, then the keychain gets locked, and if you're trying to access keychain in the background, that can also be a similar problem.
Yeah, or it might be. I think user defaults can be. They can have an attribute whether they're secured or not. It's worth
secure.
Yeah, right. It's worth looking into the details. Looking at that blog post that outlines, what the problem is, and this is apparently a real problem, and presumably the package doesn't have that problem. So that's nice.
The blog post is linked from the top of the README file, so it's literally the first link in the file.
Yeah. There you go.
So that's Tiny Storage by Christian Selig.
Nice. My first pick is called Recap by Joe Fabicevic, and you've also linked to this package in iOS Dev Weekly from Friday. And this is a really nice what's new screen for your iOS app, and it's iOS only. I was actually surprised to see this. It doesn't even call out iPadOS, so I'm not sure what state there is. It's worth looking into whether if you need this for the iPad. But it looks really simple to use. You have a YAML file where you configure what should be on that screen. You can give an entry, a title, a description, a SF symbol, name, and a color, and then it does a really nice layout. I mean, as what's new screen, you know what these look like, and all you really need to do is add the dependency and write this little YAML file, and then it does it all for you. And I think this is one of these things that is getting more important, because I hardly look at release notes in the App Store anymore, because I have, like, for ages now, I've had auto update enabled, right? So apps just update and I never see what's new. And I do actually quite like these screens. I mean, maybe not every small update needs a screen like that, but if you have like bigger changes, I think that's a really nice way to tell the user, this is what's new. Have a look, or explain why something might be in a different place or something like that. So a really nice package to deal with this aspect.
I really like this too. I thought it was great, and I think there's a couple of things worth mentioning with this. I think you're not alone in not reading release notes anymore. Nobody reads release notes because updates are on by default, and I don't remember the last time I went into updates to even see what was pending. It takes care of itself, and I never check it, which means I never see any of the update notes. It was never the greatest place to put really important information, because a lot of people never checked there. Yeah. And even if they did manually update, all they did was hit update all. So yeah, it's never been the best place. But one thing I liked about this is that you can actually page back through previous, like it's almost a release notes, nice. A changelog system, right. As well. So yes, you have the one that comes up on the screen when people launch, but if they're interested, they can page back through previous ones to see what happened to the app in previous updates. So I thought that was a nice feature worth mentioning as well.
That's nice. I hadn't even seen that. That's great.
That's great.
So that's Recap by Joe Fabicevic.
My next pick is Location Radius Picker by Eman Basic. And this is a UI view controller subclass. So not as well. I presume you could wrap it in a UI view controller. What's the wrapper class that you can wrap it into SwiftUI? But it's designed initially for UI kits rather than SwiftUI, but it's just a really nice implementation of a control that you don't get for kind of built in with UI kit, which is selecting a radius over the top of a MapKit map. So you don't want to just select a single pinpoint on the map, which I believe it does do, but if you want to give the application a X meter radius around a point, then this is a really well designed version of that. And when you zoom the map in and out, your selected radius also scales nicely with the map. It also tells you how big the radius is. So as you drag the circle out across the map, you'll see that it starts as, you drag it once and it's a 50 meter radius, and you zoom out a little bit and drag it again. Now it's a 2 kilometer radius. And again, what caught my eye with this is a fantastic demo video at the top of the README file, which is always really important if you're building anything that has a visual component. The very first thing you should do is show people what it looks like. And it was that caught my eye. Yeah, I thought this was just a useful little thing that you're not going to need this every day, but when you need it, this seemed like a well-designed one.
Nice. That sounds great. Okay, my second pick is called Swift Async Operations by Matsuji, and I only got this GitHub handle here. Unfortunately, GitHub itself only lists that name as well. And that's a really interesting library that deals with an API that I kind of struggle with. I mean, it's fine, but it feels a bit. I don't know how to describe it. I'll explain what it's about. So async let is a simple way to start concurrent tasks, right? In Swift async await land, and you use that when you have a certain number of a fixed number of tasks that you want to fire off. For instance, I've got these 2 URLs to fetch, and you do async let for both of them, and then you await, and then they run concurrently. Now, if you have a number n of tasks and you don't know n indeterminate number, and you want to, for instance, create them, spin off these tasks in a loop, you would use the with task group API, and that's the thing that I find really, like, I don't know how to describe it. Suddenly you need a lot of boilerplate, where previously async let is so lean, right? You don't even realize, maybe that's even a problem. You don't realize you're spinning up a task, but it's a really lean API. And then suddenly when you need, I don't have just 2, I have n. I can't just write a for loop or something, or have a map, and this is what this package does. You then have to employ this whole with task group thing. Then the group thing needs to do the add task, and then at the end you have to await the results, and there you loop. It's a weird, you have this progressive disclosure normally, and this feels like, oh, I'm progressively, poof, there's a truck that hits me. It's not really progressive. It's like a cliff you're hitting.
A progressive brick wall.
Yeah, exactly. So this introduces an async map and an async for each. And I know for each is controversial. Some people argue it shouldn't even be in the language, but there is sort of a reason why it perhaps should exist here in this specific case. And the reason is that both these method calls take an optional parameter, number of concurrent tasks, where you can control, like you map over something, async map over a collection, and then you can say number of concurrent tasks, and it'll fan out up to that concurrency and do the things in concurrent tasks. And async for each is the same, just not, it's like a proper for loop without returning something like the map does. I mean, obviously you could abuse map in that same sense, but just API wise, that's the distinction. Now, I haven't looked at the implementation. Take all of this with a grain of salt, because there's lots of async awaits stuff happening, and people are still finding their way how to best do things. I really wanted to highlight the package, perhaps not so much as a thing you should jump and use immediately. Certainly, if you need it, have a look at the implementation, but also maybe in talking about whether the with task group API could perhaps have a more sugary variant that is a bit nicer to use, because I feel like I need to look it up. I can't just write a with task group thing and then the awaiting stuff at the end. I need to look it up. I can't. For loop I can write, a map I can write, a for each I can write. With task group I can't. I need to look it up, and I feel like that's telling me something. I think that API could perhaps be easier, and maybe that package has ideas what that API could look like. Anyway, that's why I thought it was interesting.
Sure.
Swift Async Operations by Matsuji.
And it's worth mentioning, you briefly mentioned it there, on the topic, we quite often say, when we're talking about packages here, we quite often term them recommendations, but all we're ever saying with these picks of packages is this is something that we've found interesting. This is not we've checked through every line of code and made sure that this package is perfect in every way. Like some of the packages we've talked about today are, for example, 6 days old, and they're being mentioned more as a notable event rather than an outright recommendation, because we can't possibly have used all the packages we talk about on this podcast.
Although we try, if you look at the number of dependencies in the Swift Package Index server project, we are certainly trying.
Well, a lot of those dependencies come with Vapor, right?
Well, I still maintain we are the Swift Package Index. We have an obligation to just try them all.
And with that, it brings another episode to a close. So I think we will call it a day there and speak to you next time. And for now, we will say goodbye.
Yep. See you next time. Bye-bye.